This is a lot of pressure. I don't think I like this. I'm good at homilies. I'm lousy at talks. But as Father Lawrence said, there are some seats up here. There are 2 seats, special names on them. Two seats right here. One. This man just took it.
Can I have $20 for that?
Yeah. Before I go any further, just to clarify, I run a research institute at the University of Southern California, not of. It's independent, it's a 501c3. The whole purpose is to help scholars learn what it means to be Catholic intellectuals. It's one of the biggest problems we have in the church today. We have many Catholics with PhDs. We don't have many Catholic intellectuals or Christian intellectuals who make a real difference. So we're building an endowment, we're acquiring property. They'll come and they'll be there for months to do research and be with scholars that really treasure the faith. That's crucial. The other thing I want to do, just by way of introduction, is to introduce my executive director of the Institute, Dr. Rebecca Serling. She's right there. She drove up, obviously, from home there. She has been a terrific asset to the Institute. Has been with us for a year and a half plus, so on and so forth. So she will have some stuff for people afterwards.
Yes, I'll meet you at the table. We have bookmarks, lovely prizes.
Shameless propaganda. All right. So what I want to do this evening, I want to do in 5 steps. And I don't want to read a speech. I have it outlined. I've thought about it. And I'll take you through the steps. But I would also like to leave us some time for give and take. All right? Because I know you have lots of experience. You have your own insights. Certainly there's going to be a diversity of opinion. Welcome to the Catholic Church today. So my 5 steps are as follows. First, I'm going to say something about the larger historical context that the Catholic Church was working in for the previous 4 centuries to Vatican II. Second, I want to say something about the unique character of the Second Vatican Council, particularly when you compare it to the 2 previous councils, Vatican I and Trent. Third, I want to say something about the U.S. Catholic Church. One of the courses I teach at USC is a history of the issues that Catholic immigrants had to deal with coming to the United States in the 19th century and then on into the 20th century. Fourth, I want to talk about the profound cultural change that has taken place in this country, especially since World War II. This is not something that just grew out of the 60s. This was already afoot in a profoundly moving way right after the war. And then finally, I want to say a few things about reasons for confidence. There are a number of people that are discouraged or that are worried a lot and so on. So there are a few things to be said there that I think will be helpful. So let's start going back to the Protestant Reformation. This was a big jolt to the church. In the year 1000, there was a split between the East and the West, but you didn't feel it because they were over there. The Russian Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox, so on and so forth. But the Protestant Reformation happened right at home. And it was a trauma. And when you ever have a trauma, you tend to be kind of defensive for good reasons. You know, somebody said I was paranoid, but I don't trust them anyway. Sorry, Ken and Mary. So add on to that a kind of growing secularism, what they call the Enlightenment. This is Europe. This is all focused on Europe. There was missionary outreach to South America and in America and so on, comparable in size and reach to the evangelical efforts in Africa at the beginning of this past century. So when you go to the French Revolution, think of France as a centerpiece for the church. And you have this complete overhauling rejection, so on. Here's a lesson to have in the back of your head. Anytime a church is dominant in numbers and power and authority, it can become twice as vulnerable. Twice as vulnerable. Things collapse much more quickly. The Catholics have never been dominant in the United States. We've always been, after about 1890, 1900, 1920, we've been at least 20% to 25% of the population. That meant we had to pay attention. We had to figure out both how to be ourselves and how to fit in. Complicated kind of dance. So the French Revolution takes place. During this period, there's the Enlightenment. Did it ever occur to you that that word is rather... Who gave that period of time that name, the Enlightenment? They were the historians of that period. What shall we describe ourselves as? Well, we're enlightened. And then what? But we're not part of those dark ages. Remember that phrase? The dark, not medieval period. Dark ages. The Enlightenment put so much emphasis on reason and tried to privatize faith because they said, look, faith causes all this violence. Religion causes violence. One of the things I teach at USC, I lead a senior seminar on the subject of religions and violence. And one of the things you realize once you study the complexity of different religions and violence, religion is rarely the main reason for violence. And if you think religion is the problem, please remember, you put together Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, and Mao Zedong, you have 110 million murders. They're all atheists. So let's not assume that the problem is religion, or it's a problem of human beings that do evil things to one another. So you have the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment puts tremendous emphasis on science. And this has continued to this day. So young people often get to a point where they think the only reliable knowledge is what you can empirically prove. You cannot empirically prove, by evidence, that you can measure. You cannot empirically prove the existence of God. You cannot disprove the existence of God. And I would imagine many of you could not empirically prove that you're married to the right person. You can be very confident, you can be sure, but you can't empirically prove that. How would you do that? Do a big survey or something? Why is that point? It's funny, but it's serious. Today, we have two types of knowledge. Science, and there are marvelous things with science. I'm not going to beat up on science. They're great things. But it's really good for certain types of study. Then over here, you have opinion. And if those are the only two ways you know, religion gets categorized as opinion. And as a consequence, it's one opinion after another, and people will say, don't they? Well, religions are all different. They're just a matter of opinion. Why should I give my life to that? I'll give it to science. Would that more people really did give themselves to good science would be a great thing. But there is another kind of knowledge that is based on commitment and love. If you've never fallen in love, there's certain types of things you never understand. And reading a love poem will not do it. So science comes along, creates a very powerful cultural pressure. There's also, in this historical context, leading up to Vatican II, you have World War I, World War II. Remember, the Enlightenment was loaded with naive optimism. It was only going to get better. And one of the ways you get better is you say, leave tradition go. Tradition is the past. If you want enlightenment, you go to the future. And it's going to get better all the time. But the 20th century was the bloodiest century in history, with World War I, World War II, and the Holocaust, and continuing wars ever since, one type after another after another. So we thought, I think, in the Catholic Church that on the eve of Vatican II, where you had good Pope John and John F. Kennedy as president, there was a lot of optimism. Some of us remember that time. And that collapsed pretty quickly on into the 60s. So these are some of the aspects. I could talk about many other things, but I just want to mention these. Second point, Vatican II. Vatican II was unlike any other church council in history. Now that's a huge claim. And I consider myself a historian. What was so different? All the councils up until that time were convened usually to address a problem, a serious problem, or even to articulate a dogma about the real presence in the Eucharist or something like that, or the nature of Jesus, truly human, truly divine, and not two people, one person. You have those. Vatican II followed Trent. Trent was a response 1543 to 1562. It was a response to the Protestant Reformation, and it spent a lot of time trying to hammer out, they believe this, we believe that. They believe this, so get the doctrines right. Get the doctrines right. Not as much emphasis on how you live, the way you live, but heresy was a serious problem. Remember, heresy is a truth gone mad out of loneliness. Heretics are usually not wrong in what they affirm. They're wrong in what they leave out. Sola scriptura, said Luther. Scripture alone. Well, scripture, yes. Alone, no. So fides, faith alone. No. There are dimensions of faith and tradition. If any of you have come to faith, you usually have come to believe because you believe people who were believable. Most of you did not have a vision from heaven, or a brick would come down and hit you and say, believe. It's somebody's witness that makes the difference. And that's how we grew up in the faith, those of us who did. So you have this situation of Vatican II, Vatican I, 1869 to 1870. Why was that convened? Because the church was going through trauma. Trauma. The French Revolution. Do you know that in 1799, the Pope was captured by Napoleon? And Napoleon put him in prison. I just try to picture this with Francis or with Benedict. So put him in prison, and the Pope died in prison. His successor was captured by Napoleon and put in prison for 5 years. From 5 years, by like 1808 to 1812 or 13. There were many indignities that were placed upon the papacy. As a consequence, and especially the breakup of the Roman Empire and the birth of nation states, all that kind of independent kind of activity in Europe, they said, look, we've got to bring order back to things. We've got to have some type of control. And that council, Vatican I, decreed papal infallibility. I ended up doing my doctorate on that subject. So don't ask any questions. But this should be interesting to you. The birth of the phrase papal infallibility, now that you ask me, actually arose for the first time in history at the end of the 13th century and the beginning of the 14th. Up until that time, Christians believed that the Bible in some sense was infallible, and that the church as a whole was infallible. The gates of hell will not prevail against it, and so on. But the notion that somehow a decree of a pope could be infallible was first caused at that time by a big debate with the Franciscans, who were getting very much out of line at that time. That's another story. So that's Vatican I. And Vatican I wants to do two things. It tries to say faith and reason are not opposed. Both are important, and I think that's really important. Vatican I was absolutely right about it. And the second thing was because the Enlightenment was saying it's only reason. Reason's the only thing that's worthwhile, not faith. And the second thing they did was they declared the Pope infallible under certain strict circumstances. What happens? We have these two world wars. Pope John Giuseppe Roncalli, very interesting pope, a historian, actually, a very humorous man, gets elected as a kind of caretaker after someone who has been in papacy for 20 years, Pius XII. And in 1958, he's elected, and I would really like to know if anybody knows this. I specialize in trivia. It was assumed at that time, 1958, 1959, that there would be no councils ever again, no church councils, and no pope would ever use the name John. Anybody know why? Dr. Serling, you be quiet. She's a historian. What happened?
Was the previous John was corrupt, or?
The previous John, Pope, the previous John was a false pope. And that pope took the name John the 23rd. There was a time we had 3 popes, and they got them to resign. They forced them to resign. It was, you know, and talk about a tough time in the church. Imagine Europe being divided up, or the church as a whole now, among 3 different popes claiming legitimacy. Do you think we got problems today? Let's get some historical perspective. So there would not be anybody who would call themselves John. And what did he do? He called himself John and used that same number to say that guy was false. What's the other reason? Why no council? What did I just say? Yeah, if the Pope is infallible, you don't need to consult anybody. Wrong. Wrong. That's another whole subject. I'm not going to go into it. But it's interesting. So Vatican II comes together, and the Pope announces the purpose of Vatican II is, in fact, to rejuvenate the faith of the people. And he also speaks about mercy rather than dogmas. He speaks about the importance of trying to reach out to Protestant brothers and sisters. He talks about other religions. One of the decrees, Nostra Aetate, of Vatican II, talk positively about other religions. They have a ray of truth in them, and they need to be respected, and so on and so forth. For those of you that grew up before Vatican II, you know that there were certain things you weren't supposed to do, including entering a Protestant church. My mom and dad, my dad was Protestant, my mom was Catholic, and they were rural Ohio, and nobody was happy with the marriage. Not even my father's only brother would come to the wedding. And of course the Catholics, they wouldn't allow it to be in church. It had to be in the priest's house. Keep it low profile. I personally am very glad my parents got married. I'm serious. I and my 4 siblings. And my dad agreed to raise all of us in Catholic schools and so on and so forth. That's another whole story. I'd love to tell you that sometime. So, Vatican II is a very different council. It issues no anathema sits. What is that? Anybody who holds this teaching is forbidden. Anathema sit. This teaching is forbidden. Anathema sit. Church councils have done these up until the present time. The tone here is not that at Vatican II. The tone is one of trying to encourage people and move them from the heart about living the Christian life in a deeper way. And it does that in no less than 16 documents. If any of you have ever tried to plow through the documents, written by committees of Vatican II, even though they're beautifully written in many instances, you got a book that's that thick. For you in the back, that's almost 2 inches. So this was very unusual from this point of view. And it created a lot of positive feeling in a lot of ways. Nobody could have guessed what happened right after the council closed. Nobody can anticipate everything. So I move now to a consideration of a couple things that happened. One of them, the liturgy was to be renewed. The liturgy was to be updated. The liturgy was in the vernacular, the Mass, and the music would be. Well, that's all good, and participation is good. But I think in a lot of places, a deep sense of reverence has been lost. I personally love the Latin Mass. I don't have any problem celebrating the Latin Mass. I love Gregorian chant. But I will not celebrate it for people who want that Mass in order to reject Vatican II. Too many liturgists thought that was passé, it's all over. We should keep that. That's part of a tradition, and it's a rich part of the tradition. Another thing that happened, put a lot of emphasis on you folks, on the laity. When the Protestants said the priesthood of the faithful is really important, that is baptism, Catholics reacted, remember, defensively, and they said it's the ordained priesthood. It's both. It's both. And it took us a long time to begin to recognize, and we're still not there, the dignity of baptism as the call to holiness. For everybody. It's like when people say to me, hey, Father, pray for me, you got a direct line. I say, I do not have a direct line. You and I have the same line. Let's pray together. It's very, very important. So keep that in mind. Another thing that happened. We had situations where we began to talk about the importance of reaching out to Protestants, ecumenism, to try to form unity. Very important. I'm all for it. And then we also said, let's talk with the Jews. Look what happened to the Jews. One of the reasons what happened to the Jews was we forgot the Jewish roots of the Christian religion. It's very clear. It's very clear. But for a number of people, this led to a kind of relativism. In other words, whether you're Protestant or Catholic or whether you're Jewish or not, or doesn't make any difference. All religions basically teach the same thing. Do they? I don't think so. I don't think so. I had a student years ago at the University of Dayton. Never forget this. It was the first day of class, and the course was on Catholic doctrines. And I said to the students, I said, I have a syllabus, there's stuff I want to go through, but I want to know what you got any questions? Is there anything about doctrine, so on the bottom? One guy put up his hand, and he said to me, he says, yeah, I think the Catholic Church is arrogant. I said, oh, why do you say that? Because it says it's the one true church. I said, well, that isn't quite right, but what do you think it should say? He said, well, it should say that all religions are basically the same. I said, oh. So I said to him, do you know anything about Islam? He said, no. Do you know anything about Buddhism? Actually, no. How about Confucianism? You know anything about? No, I don't. Do you know anything about Judaism? He said, well, I knew a girl in high school who was Jewish. That's not my question. Do you know anything about Judaism? He says, no. And I said, let me get this straight. You think the Catholic Church is arrogant because it says it's the only true religion. You don't know anything about all these religions, and you say they're all equal. Who's worse? Now, that's not the way to start a class. But I witnessed his wedding 4 years later. So, we made up. But I mean, how do you understand these kind of questions without falling into relativism? And as I'll say, the bigger problem today is not even all religions are the same. The bigger problem today is what's the point of religion?